pursuant to Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11-2H4. Chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment. Associate Chief Counsel Thomas Kane. And by the next day, February 4th, Thomas Kane figured out Lois Lerner's hard drive crashed in 2011, which is why many of her emails about Ms. Lerner's hard drive crash and missing emails in mid-April. And still, Mr. Koskinen failed to take basic steps to try to locate the documents, her BlackBerry, the server, the backup server, and her laptop that was on loan. In fact, the IRS barely Deputy Inspector of Investigations at TIGTA, the Inspector General, summed it up by testifying, and I say, in quote, he said, quote, "The best we found them because we looked for them," end quote. It is important to note Mr. Koskinen has never made an attempt to clarify or amend any of his prior statements. That again, remember, it was the President who stood up in the White House and told us all that he was going to get somebody new in there to work hand in hand with Congress to try to make sure this never ever happened again. But again, a more recent GAO report found nothing has changed. The environment for targeting still exists. GAO found there still are, end quote. Mr. Koskinen, the President's turnaround artist, has done nothing to prevent the IRS from targeting other Americans for their political beliefs.